Okay, now I'm going to show you a kind of a better way for creating that UV map. And pretty much the reason I showed you the other way was just so that you can get an idea of some of the other methods there are for UV mapping, because there's lots of different ways of doing a UV map for the same model. Sometimes things are easier than others, and sometimes they're not. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is actually, I am going to be changing this model quite a bit and breaking it up and unwelding points. And I don't want to mess up our original model, but I can't just copy and paste it and work with that because those polygons won't be linked together. So what I need to do is actually create a morph map. And from that morph map, we'll be creating our UV map that we'll use for our base morph, which will be our unedited object. So go to the M tab down here, which will allow us to create a morph map, and we're going to select new. And we're going to call this morph 001 underscore UV, or actually 003 UV. And we'll just use the relative values and click OK. And now we can start editing this object, and it won't affect our model because we're using a morph. So pretty much what we want to do now is pick where we want our seam to be. So I'm just going through and selecting some of these polygons to find out where we want the seam and where we need to break it up, because we do need to make it into a two-dimensional model. So we can deselect all of this. I'm just going to come through and select all of those polygons in there. And pretty much one edge of this is going to be our seam. And it depends on which seam we want to pick. We want to pick pretty much the straightest line that we can, and something that's going to be inside the most, which is pretty much going to be this inside edge right there. So what we actually want to do now is go to our point mode, and I am going to change this to wireframe shade, and we are going to select all of the points along that line and bring that down into the inside of the object, making sure that we have all of them selected, just going over it a couple of times just to make sure. And we are going to go to detail and unweld. And now we have unwelded all of these points, and we can go in and start editing this polygon. Another thing I actually want to do is turn off subpatches. So I'm going to deselect everything, hit tab on the keyboard, and now we can see our model in sort of the UV mode we were in before. And we can start using this morph map as our UV. So now we can work with it in a three-dimensional view and get a better idea of where all of our pieces are at. And we can also break this up in a couple of different methods, which we are pretty much going to have to. But right now, we'll start working on these points we already have done. Now, typically, when we select a polygon right here and we go to Edit, Control T to drag, and we start dragging the points out, it will take everything with it. But we unwelded all of the points out of our seam. So what we can do now is actually start pulling these out, which will allow us to edit our model, making sure we select that polygon first. And just dragging these points out along the seam, just so we can get a hold of them a little bit easier. And you notice that we are breaking up the polygons, so all we really have to do is just go to our points, and we can weld those back together. But now we have the nice break in there. We also look like we have a non-planar polygon in here. So we'll go ahead and edit this a little bit, and we just want to start moving stuff around, because now we're going to be unwrapping it in 3D, which is actually going to be a lot easier. And we'll go in and just select all of these polygons, and actually we'll probably select a couple of them, and that way we don't have to weld them back together. So if we select all those, and then we can weld that back in there. And we can see that we already have that seam kind of started. And we'll grab our polygons in here. And actually we have kind of a weird effect going on with these ones. So I'm going to deselect all these and move this down so that we can see our polygon, since it is non-planar and it was not showing up. So we can start pulling that out, and we're going to need to actually weld those points together right here. And I'll just do that right away so we don't lose track of what's supposed to be connected and what's not supposed to be connected. Weld that back together, and then reselect all these polygons along that seam. Control T for drag, and we can drag these points out. And actually, when we're done with this, we're going to end up doing a planar UV map, which is the reason why we're unstretching it in 3D right now with this morph map, is because when we create our UV map, it's going to be really easy just to planar map it, because we don't have to worry about those back polygons, because we're just going to flatten this out entirely. And we're also going to have to create a few more seams once we have this major seam done, because we do have an extrusion right here. So we might even create a seam down the back and lift these polygons upward. But we're going to just break up everything that we've already created first, just so we can get that out of the way. Undo. Make sure we select that other polygon. We'll just bring this out. And we just want to move these just a little. It's a little hard to tell right now where everything's really going. But it'll show up a little bit better later once we kind of unwrap all of this. So now we want to do our bottom part. So we can unwrap that, and maybe we'll move these polygons a little so we can see them a little better. We'll come in here, and actually I want to weld those two back there. And select those polygons. Undo, because actually I need to undo that weld, because I ended up selecting the points of the other polygon. So I need to move that out first, and then I can weld them together, because otherwise it'll connect it back to the whole object. So you want to make sure you have 2 points showing up and not 4 like we just had. And now we'll just come through like we did before and just move that out a little, just so we're separating it and creating our seam. Okay, so now we have our back seam pretty much all the way done for the major part, and we can start kind of pulling some of these polygons out. So I'm going to hit 0 on the keyboard, and actually we're pretty much doing all this in the perspective view for the most part. We will be using the other viewports a little bit later to kind of bring things together, but right now we'll just use this view and just start pulling these points out and just kind of unwrapping our model and making it more two-dimensional. We are going to have to do another cut in here in just a little bit, just for this back part where we have that extrusion, so otherwise that's going to be very difficult to create that map for and get those polygons sorted out. And basically what we're looking for is just being able to see all of our polygons in the front viewport or from facing it directly on. And we want to go ahead now and actually split these couple down here so that we can work with those polygons down there as well. So we want to unweld those. So detail, unweld, and select our polygons and just start bringing that upward. And you can see how this is somewhat an easier way of doing it than the other method I just showed you, because we can see it in 3D. And by using a morph map, we don't have to worry about messing up our original model. And of course, we'll be stretching these all inward later. But we need to kind of get these out of the way. And I'm going to go ahead and deselect all those polygons, and we need to bring this upward, just so we can see everything from that front view. We can see that that point is down really far. We just pull that up. And we're just going to work these out and make it just a little bit flatter, because we do kind of have it jumbled right now. And we might even need to look at this another viewport just to get this sorted out. But right now we just want to break it up, just so we can see it and get a clear understanding of where everything is at. And go ahead and break that off. And we might even need to break this off right here as well. And we actually disconnected those two polygons then. So we want to deselect that, grab this one up here, and then we can merge those points back together, or weld them, actually. Control W if you can't remember. And now we have that. So now we can start bringing out the bottom part as well. We also need to stretch that out. And right now, like I said, it doesn't really matter that we can see everything in one view just yet. We just want to kind of break apart the model into kind of a second dimension. And actually this inside part too is going to be lifted upward later, which I'll show you in just a little bit. And that's going to take a little bit of time. I'll show you that. And we can just start bringing this stuff down. It's just like we're editing the UV map directly in the 3D view. Just bringing all these points down, and then making sure that it's not too jumbled, so that we can see everything that's going on here. And going ahead and moving this over, and that right there on the outside. And like I said, we're going to need to actually bring down all of this stuff so it's stretching out to here, which is all the inside polygons. But we'll get to that once we're done unwrapping our outer polygons and getting that all sorted out. And we'll come down here and start working on the other side. Just pulling it out. You can see it a little bit better. And you can see we didn't really need to split this side at all because we didn't have an extrusion. And if you remember when we made this part of the model, we actually went ahead and extruded that piece. And that actually makes it more difficult when you're doing a UV map. Okay, so we got this split, and we can move that over. And we will also need to split this, because there's one polygon we did not do. And that is this bottom one. It needs to be disconnected on two sides. So we'll grab that polygon and see which points, if there's any unwelded. And it doesn't look like there is. So we'll go ahead and grab those points and unweld it. And now we can grab that polygon and drag in that polygon right there. So that'll be a lot easier then to kind of separate. We could even separate it from this other side too. so it stretches out even more, because that is all the way on the inside. But that should be alright for right now. We'll just check on our other part. We can see that that is disconnected for the most part, which we also have more geometry up there, so it's going to be a little bit different. And we'll just start pulling this stuff out. On the sides. And let's take a look at our 4 views now. And you can see if we're looking at our front view right here, we still have a little bit jumbled over here. And we will need to kind of work around with these polygons in these other views to get a better idea of where they're at. But we can see that it's looking real clean already. And it definitely looks better than our first planar model that we had for the UV. And it is looking better than the Atlas just because, well, it's a lot easier to work with than that Atlas map. Because we don't have to find out where pieces go, they already are there because we're working with the actual model, and we don't need to worry about guessing and finding where the pieces go, because that can take a very long time. We just want to move some of these points out now, and now we kind of need to stretch out our centers of these tubes. Although we could just cut them and kind of bring them upward and unwrap them. I want to keep them connected so it's much easier and we have a much cleaner UV so we don't get a seam once we start hitting the inside. So what we actually need to do is start grabbing these points section by section and just pulling them upward. So we'll just go through and start doing that now. And it's going to look a little weird as we're doing it, but once we get that last section all the way up, it should look nice and clean. And we'll delete, or make sure we deselect all of our points and go in here and start selecting this first row. And hit T on the keyboard and just move that up. And then go to that next row on the inside and grab those points and bring them up. And then just keep going and working our way down. Although it can be a little difficult to select some of these, so I'm actually gonna pull this out just a little so we can see in the inside and actually select those points. And T and just move it up and just making sure we're moving it up past the other set of points that we have in here. And now this one we can actually select in this model directly and just bring that up so it is above the next set of points. So pretty much we just turn that inside out. And now we want to go ahead and start pulling that out. And we accidentally grabbed 2 points right there. So we want to make sure we just grab those. And then just that we're working this outward. Just grabbing these inside ones and pulling them out. And this is going to create a very clean UV map. Well, once we get it, I'll sort it out. Anyway. And you can see it's starting to look real clean through here as well. But the main reason, instead of actually using this view to do it, I'm using the 3D views, because we can get a better idea, like I said before, of kind of where things are at, and what needs to be edited, and what doesn't. And that way, too, we don't have any overlapping polygons. And if we have any problems, we can just take a direct look at the 3D and find out why it's looking the way it is. We'll just pull that out, and now we can see this is looking real clean up here. And we can start actually editing within this view before we go ahead and flatten it out, because we are just going to go ahead and flatten it. We don't need to, but I think it will help when it comes to actually editing the model so we're not distracted by what the perspective view looks like with our non-planar polygons. And we also want to make sure that these are mostly square and they're not too squished together. But of course we'll edit that a lot more and do some tweaking. UV maps can take some time to tweak, and you mostly want to, in the end, for something like this, where all of our polygons are relatively the same size, at least in the inside of the tube here, we just want to make sure that those are actually showing up correctly, and that we have all of our polygons pretty much the same size. And it'll just make it the image map be less distorted if they're all square and relatively the same size. Sometimes we can't do that entirely, but we can still get it as close as we possibly can. And another thing is too, once you're in this point, you don't want to be using polygon edit mode, because that way, if you do have any points that are not welded together, you'll create some errors. Okay, so what we want to do now is go ahead and do the same thing we did on top to the bottom tube, and just pull those points out. And that'll actually be quite simple. We'll just use this view this time instead of doing it in our perspective view. Just making sure that we don't select any points on the actual outside of the model and just on the inside. Okay, now we have those sorted out, and we can start unwrapping that in our 3D view. Okay, I've gone ahead and just did that bottom part the same way as we did the top part. And now what we can actually do is go ahead and just flatten this whole thing. So I'm going to hit H on the keyboard and just stretch everything together. And what we can do now is just actually go in and edit this like it was a UV map. Or we could create the UV map first and start editing the actual UV. But sometimes it might be easier in this case just to still use this model. And I'm going to go ahead and pull all these points down, just so we're keeping our polygons about the same size and we don't have too much stretching. And you just want to clean it up. And all these need to become straighter. And this is something I'm not going to go too far into just because it does take a long time to get it perfect. And I'm not going to play with it too long, because otherwise this chapter is going to be several hours long, just showing you how to tweak it. But you should pretty much get an idea now on how to edit this part right here for creating our UV map, which we're going to go ahead and just create now, that we have a nice layout, which should look real nice for our UV here. Alright, so we're going to go to Texture Map and New, and I'm going to call this Part 3 and just overwrite that other one, and we're going to do it planar on the Z-axis and click OK. Now if we go to our UV texture, we'll see that it is really messed up. And the reason for that is we need to weld our points back together before we go ahead and create that UV. So I'm going to undo that, and we're going to take a look at our model, and I just want to hit M on the keyboard, and that's 38 points I just merged together that we had left over. So now we'll go back and recreate that UV map on the Y, planar, click OK, and we still have some issues here to work out. So I'll undo that again, and I'm going to try creating a new map, and not overwriting the last one, so I'll call it part 003-2 and click OK. And now you see that we get our perfect UV map, or as perfect as it is without all the tweaking. So this is, our UV map is pretty much done, and we can use this now to apply to our model. Actually, if we go back to our morphs, Go back to our base object, which is still perfect. And we'll change this to our perspective. Hit tab, and that looks okay. We do have to merge and weld back some of these points together. So now that we're in this view, we want to hit M, and we can see that no points were eliminated. So we're actually going to have to go in and actually weld some of these points back together. In some of these certain parts. But if we take a look at the UV now, we can see we start getting these red dots in here. And what that's showing is pretty much that these are connected to another part of the model. So pretty much this is connected to this, or this is to this, because we have it wrapped downward. And actually, it's probably... no, it's not those. And it's not quite showing up right now. But it's pretty much showing that those aren't the exact polygons, and those are the ones that need to be kind of welded together. So we're going to go back to our perspective view, and we'll hit tab. And we can tell pretty easily which ones need to be welded back together. And even though it was on our base object, since we did do some editing here, it did affect our actual model. But that's okay. Like I said, all we got to do is just go back here and grab these points and just weld them back together, which will put us back where we were before. Just working our way all the way down. And just finding out which ones are still separate. Because we do get some weird looking effects in here. And I am going to hit D on the keyboard and bring up our cages. So viewport, top right, show cages, and now we can see how this is kind of reflecting in our object. So you just want to go through up and down and just kind of weld these points together. That should be back where they were before. Because if you notice, a lot of these are still separated, but once we weld them, it starts to look okay again and back where we were at. But this is definitely much easier than it would be the other UV mapping way I showed you before, which is actually a way that a lot of people use, unfortunately, which is kind of difficult. So go back to our UV texture and take a look and see how that's looking, and that looks great still. So now too, what we can also do is, this isn't quite finished welding, but I'll just show you really quick, that we can hit Shift D and metaform it, and now go to our UV texture and see that for the most part it's back in the same place. So we do have some random points in there, and those are points that haven't been welded yet. So just kind of ignore those right now and notice that our UV map is still very clean, and that if we metaformed this earlier, we would have had to edit all of these points in order to get this UV map, and instead we were able to do it now at that earlier stage before we metaformed it. So if we undo and kind of show that, you'll see that we went from that and edit and just hit redo, and we can just switch back and forth between the two and see that instead of editing all of these points, we only had to edit these ones. So it's definitely something we want to do at the earlier stage of the model, and then we can go in and start adding our detail if we need to. In this case, I'm not really going to add any more detail to it because I don't think it really needs any more. But you can get an idea now on how to UV map this heart and bring it into a 3D Paint program or even Photoshop, because that'd be pretty simplistic to actually use that UV we had before just to paint on it in Photoshop and get an idea how that works, or any 2D paint program. It doesn't necessarily have to be Photoshop, although that is the probably the most widely used program along with Lightwave. Another thing this also helps out with too is if you're exporting this into, let's say, ZBrush, and you want to go in and add the veins as a displacement map and do all that, this will be great for it too. You can also do painting within ZBrush, or you can bring it into lots of different programs. Deep Paint 3D for doing that, and there's just a lot of different things available if you have that accessible to you and you want to do it that way. Otherwise, 2D Paint program will work, and you can map your image maps on there, and it'll turn out pretty perfectly. So once we go ahead and weld everything back together and do the UV maps for all the other pieces, which you want to do exactly the same as you did this, where you want to split those tubes over here, and in this case we'll want to create a seam. We'll take a look at our main model here. If I was to do this one, I would create a seam along this line down here all the way to the bottom, and then also create another seam over on the side here, through the center, and then down over to here, and just kind of break it all up. And using the exact same methods we just used for creating the other UV map, you can use on this one and this next piece of the model. This one will be a little easier than this one. And then you'll have your UV maps ready to go. You don't have to worry about your morph maps anymore, but you just want to save it with the morph maps anyway, even though you won't be using them. And you can even delete your morph maps if you want to. But another thing I wanted to show you that I wanted to get back to is actually that UV map, that UV texture settings we were talking about before, where we have it subdivided and we can actually view that. If we go to Windows, and go to Vertex Map panel and extend texture, and we have this part 3 selected, it's turned on, we can go through all the different selections that we had available when we were actually making the map. Linear is what we use by default, and it shows us our main polygons. Subpatch will show us our subpatch views, and then linear corners, and you'll get some different edges here where these are welded to other points. It actually becomes not subpatched, and then we can show that. So you can go through those different things, and depending what's easier for you to work with, it might be easier to work with subpatches if you wanted to, although I like just using the linear view. So that pretty much wraps it up, and now we've created this heart, which you can finish up your UVs for, and if you want, paint a nice little texture on it, add some veins, things like that. What we could also do is go ahead and metaform this one. So if you want to metaform this object after you've created your UV map, which I suggest doing first, and coming in here and doing some of the details. Like I said before, we wanted to kind of bring these in, and this would have been difficult to do, to get this nice defined line as we just see now, that we just quickly made, if we wouldn't have metaformed it. And then you can go in here, edit different things, maybe make this not so round in some areas, make it come in and out more, and just play around with it as much as you want. You could also lift this up now so it kind of matches more to these other sections that are coming out, and you have a lot more detail now. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and hope you learned how to model a heart correctly, and you can use this method for lots of other different organic models. And always keep your UV maps in mind before you start going to higher res ends of your organic modeling. And we will see you in the next tutorial.